There was a seat at that wedding for every single person my mother loved. There was a seat for the cousin who had not called her in 3 years. There was a seat for her new husband's coworkers, people whose names she had only learned 6 months before. There was even a seat for a neighbor she barely spoke to anymore. But there was no seat for me, Patricia, her only daughter. The one who had spent the past 2 years quietly covering her bills, driving her to appointments, listening to every complaint she had about her loneliness, and believing every word when she said she could not have survived any of it without me. The hardest part was not finding out I had been left out. The hardest part was finding out that my mother had never planned to include me at all, and that the story she told me about why I could not come had been a lie she constructed carefully, long before the flights were ever booked. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something honestly. If someone you had done everything for looked you in the eye and told you a lie to keep you away from a moment that mattered, how long would it take you to stop making excuses for them? Because I kept making them for a very long time. Keep listening, because what I found and what I decided to do with it changed the direction of my entire life. My name is Patricia, and I am 34 years old. I work as a licensed occupational therapist at a rehabilitation center in the Pacific Northwest. I have a small apartment, a good car, a solid group of friends I built over years, and a savings account I protect carefully because I know what it feels like to not have one. By any reasonable measure, my life looks stable from the outside, but there is a version of my story that most people around me do not know. There is a version that starts not with my career or my apartment, but with a childhood spent being the responsible one in a house where responsibility was never shared fairly, and ends with a decision that I had to make alone, in silence, with no applause and no audience, because the people who should have been cheering for me were the very ones I was finally walking away from. My mother's name is Renata. She is 58 years old and has always been beautiful in the way that draws attention without effort. She walks into rooms and people notice. She laughs loudly and people smile. She has a warmth that comes across as genuine to strangers, and that took me many years to understand was selective. Her warmth was always available for people she wanted something from or people she wanted to impress. For me, it was rationed, given in doses. Tied to conditions I was never clearly told about but always somehow expected to meet. My father was not part of my life after I turned 11. He left, and the leaving was not dramatic. There was no screaming and no breaking of dishes. He simply stopped coming home one week, and my mother explained it by saying he had chosen a different life. She said it calmly, which scared me more than tears would have. After that, it was just the two of us in a rented house in a small city in Oregon, and from that point on I understood without being told that I was expected to become whatever she needed. I cooked dinner on the nights she worked late. I did laundry on the weekends. I helped with the bills when I was old enough to understand what they were. I got good grades because she made it clear that good grades were not optional. And I did all of it without complaint, because the version of my mother that appeared when she was pleased with me was the warmest, most wonderful person I knew. The version that appeared when she was disappointed was someone else entirely. I went to college on a partial scholarship and a combination of grants and loans I am still paying down. My mother contributed almost nothing financially but spoke often to relatives and friends about how proud she was of me, how hard she had worked to raise a daughter who could take care of herself. I was careful even then not to correct her. I wanted her to be proud of me. I wanted that very badly for a very long time. By the time I graduated and started working, my mother had moved from Oregon to a smaller town in California, closer to her sister. She called me regularly, and the calls almost always ended with a need. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was advice about a bill she had gotten or a landlord who was giving her trouble. Sometimes it was just emotional processing that went on for an hour, always centered on her pain and her exhaustion and how hard everything was. I listened every time. I sent money when she asked. I drove down to see her 3 or 4 times a year, and each visit involved a list of tasks she needed done around the house or errands she had been putting off. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to understanding why the Hawaii situation hurt me as deeply as it did. I was not a resentful daughter giving help. Reluctantly, I was someone who genuinely loved her mother and genuinely believed that love was something you showed through action. I believed that what I was doing would eventually come back to me in some form, not necessarily money or favors, but just the basic recognition that I was someone who mattered. I kept waiting for that. For years, I kept waiting. When my mother told me in late autumn of 2021 that she had met someone, I was happy for her. His name was Douglas, and she described him as steady, kind, and retired, with a house of his own and 2 adult sons who lived out of state. She was glowing when she talked about him. I had never heard her sound that light, and I remember thinking that maybe this was exactly what she needed, a companion who could be present in the way I had never been able to fully be from a distance. I encouraged her, I asked questions about him, I told her she deserved to be happy. By the spring of 2022, she told me they were engaged. She called on a Tuesday morning and I had just gotten to work. I stepped outside into the parking lot to take the call because I could hear from her voice that it was important. She told me about the ring, about the proposal at a restaurant he had taken her to, about how she had cried when he asked. She told me they were planning a destination wedding in Hawaii because Douglas had always wanted to go and she had always dreamed of an ocean ceremony. I told her it sounded magical. I meant it. Then she said something that I held on to for months as proof of how much she loved me. She said, "Patricia, I want you there. I want you standing next to me. I want this to be something we share." I held that sentence like it was a gift. I replayed it. I told my closest friend about it. I started looking at time off from work. I even looked at flights casually just to get a sense of what planning might look like. The wedding was penciled in for February of 2023, which gave me plenty of time to save and organize. But then slowly the shape of things started to shift. Over the following months, my mother began talking about the wedding less and less when we spoke. When I asked about details, she was vague. When I asked if she needed help with anything, she said not yet. When I mentioned taking time off from work to be there, she said things were still being figured out. I assumed she was overwhelmed with planning. I assumed she and Douglas were navigating the logistics of a destination wedding, which is genuinely complicated. I gave her space. I waited. In November of 2022, I sent her a message asking directly about the date so I could formally request time off from work. It took her 4 days to respond. When she did, she wrote a long message that I have saved on my phone and have read probably 100 times since. In that message, she told me that because of ongoing COVID travel restrictions, they had made the difficult decision to keep the wedding extremely small. She said it was just going to be Douglas's two sons, her sister Marguerite, and the officiant. She said she was heartbroken about it, but that her health and Douglas's health had to come first. She said she hoped I understood and that she was planning a big celebration party back in California in the spring that would include everyone she loved. I believed her. I want to say that clearly because it matters for everything that follows. I believed her completely. I felt sad, but I understood. We had all lived through 2 years of pandemic disruption by then, and small, intimate ceremonies were common. I called her and told her I loved her and that I supported whatever decision kept her safe. She cried a little on the phone. She thanked me. She said I was her greatest comfort. The wedding happened in February of 2023. I sent flowers to her hotel and a card. I called her the morning of to wish her happiness. She picked up and her voice was warm and a little distracted, which I assumed was the natural energy of a wedding day. She said she loved me and that she would call when it was over and tell me everything. I sat with a cup of coffee that morning and felt genuinely happy for her even though I was not there. She did call me after. She described the beach. She described the ceremony. She said it had been intimate and beautiful and that the officiant had said something that made her cry. She said she missed me and could not wait to see me at the spring party. The spring party never happened. There was always a reason. First, it was that Douglas's youngest son had a health thing that required their attention. Then it was that Douglas himself had a minor procedure and the recovery was taking longer than expected. Then it was that the summer was too hot and stressful and she just needed rest. By fall of 2023, the party had quietly disappeared from every conversation we had. And when I gently mentioned it, she said something vague about doing something at Christmas instead, which also never made. Realized. I noticed all of this, but I kept telling myself there were reasonable explanations, because that is what I had always done. I was very practiced at finding reasonable explanations for my mother's behavior. What changed everything was not something I went looking for, it found me. In March of 2024, I was on my phone scrolling through a social media platform I barely use, mostly because my friend had tagged me in something and I went to check it. While I was on there, the algorithm did what algorithms do. It showed me a suggested post from a photographer based in Maui named Kezia Torres. Kezia was a wedding photographer and she had posted a highlight reel from her favorite weddings of the past year. It was a beautiful set of photos. I almost kept scrolling. But something made me stop. There was a photo in the reel that I recognized, not because I had been there, because the woman in the white dress standing on the sand had a smile I had known my entire life. It was my mother. I stopped breathing for a moment, then I kept looking. The photo was from February 2023. There were at least 30 people in the shots. I could see Aunt Marguerite. I could see Douglas's sons. I could see people I did not recognize but who were clearly guests dressed in formal attire. There were leis and long tables set with flowers and a reception area set up on a terrace overlooking the ocean. It was not a small, bare ceremony with 5 people because of COVID restrictions. It was a full wedding, a real one, with guests and music and a photographer who had clearly been hired to document the whole thing. I sat with my phone in my hands for a long time. My apartment was quiet. The light through my window was the particular kind of afternoon light that makes everything look normal and nothing felt normal. I went to the photographer's page and kept looking. There were more photos. I found them by searching the location tag and cross-referencing the date. In total, I counted at least 28 guests in various shots. There were people laughing at tables. There were people dancing. There were children running on the sand near the reception. It was a whole, beautiful, real wedding that my mother had told me could not happen the way I imagined because of health concerns. that apparently had not been concerning enough to stop everyone else from coming. I did not call my mother that night, I could not. I sat with the information alone and tried to understand what it meant. The first thing I tried to do was be fair. Maybe the photographer had the date wrong. I went back and checked. The tags were specific. February 14, 2023, Valentine's Day, the same day my mother had told me she was getting married. I checked the photographer's business page and saw that the wedding was listed under testimonials. My mother's new last name, her married name with Douglas, was right there. Renata Calloway, now Renata Hayford. The second thing I tried to do was find an innocent explanation. Maybe some of those guests had been added last minute. Maybe the restrictions had been lifted between the time she told me and the date. But that did not explain why she had not called me and said the situation changed and invited me to come. And it did not explain why the party she promised me had never happened. The third thing I did was look more carefully at the guest list as far as I could reconstruct it from the photos. I recognized Aunt Marguerite, who was clearly present and visibly dressed up for the occasion. I recognized two cousins I had not spoken to in years but who were clearly there. I saw a woman who I later confirmed through her own public social media posts was Douglas's sister, a woman named Carol who had flown in from Arizona. There were colleagues of Douglas's from his former job. There were people who had clearly flown to Hawaii specifically for this event, and there was no COVID restriction in sight, no masks, no distancing, just a full, open, beautiful celebration from which I had been deliberately excluded. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first hours. It was not anger, not at first, it was grief. A specific kind of grief that has no clean name, but that anyone who has ever felt the sting of being unwanted by someone who is supposed to love them unconditionally will recognize instantly. It is the grief of proof, because doubt can live alongside love, but proof is different. Proof removes the comfortable ambiguity that lets you keep making excuses for someone. I did not sleep much that night. In the morning, I got up, made coffee, went to work, and did my job because there were patients depending on me, and I have never let personal pain interfere with professional responsibility. That is a thing I learned very young. You carry your own weight and you do not make your wounds everyone else's problem. That had always been my mother's lesson for me, delivered mostly by example. She had just never applied it to hers. LF. Over the next few days, I did something I had never done before in relation to my mother. I started writing things down, not to build a case, not with any plan in mind. I started writing because I needed to see the pattern outside of my own head where it had lived for too long in a context that always softened it. I wrote down every time she had told me she needed money and I had sent it. I had records. I am organized. I had bank transfer confirmations going back 5 years. The total, when I added it up carefully, was just under $11,000. That did not include groceries I had bought during visits, or gas for drives I had made, or the subscription services I quietly paid on her behalf that she had mentioned she could not afford. If I included everything, the number was closer to 15,000. I wrote down every time she had mentioned the wedding to me in a way that implied I was part of her plans. I had text messages. I had the voicemail from when she first told me about the engagement and said she wanted me standing next to her. I had all of it. I wrote down the COVID story she had given me with the date it was sent. Then I wrote down the date of the photographer's post, the number of guests visible, and the lack of any restriction-related evidence in any of the images. By the end of that week, I had 3 pages of notes and a very clear picture. The next week, I did something else I had not done before. I reached out to Aunt Marguerite. She and I had never been close, but we had always been cordial. I sent her a text that was careful and not accusatory. I said I had come across some photos from the wedding and that they were beautiful, and I asked if she had had a good time. I kept it light. I just wanted to see how she would respond. She responded within an hour. She said the wedding had been lovely. She said Douglas and my mother were so happy. She said it was a beautiful crowd and that the venue on the beach was stunning. She did not once mention COVID. She did not once mention that it had been a restricted or limited ceremony. She wrote about it the way a person writes about a normal, uncomplicated celebration, because of course that is exactly what it was. I thanked her and said nothing more. That response confirmed everything. There was no restriction, there was no health concern. My mother had looked me in the eye, or at least in the phone, and constructed a lie specifically designed to explain my absence while hiding the fact that my absence was something she had chosen to engineer. She had invited 30 other people. She had not invited her only daughter. And she had covered it with a story designed to make me feel like I understood, like I was being supportive, like I was the kind of loving daughter who could accept a disappointment gracefully. She had used my own loyalty against me. I spent about 2 weeks in a very quiet internal state. I went to work, I came home, I cooked dinner, I talked to my friends about other things. I was not plotting or scheming. I was just processing slowly, the way a person processes something large and structural that changes the shape of how they see their own life. During those 2 weeks, I did not reach out to my mother. Our usual calls happened less frequently anyway, maybe once every week or two, so my silence was not unusual enough to raise flags. She called once and I let it go to voicemail. Her message was ordinary. She talked about Douglas. She mentioned a trip they were planning. She asked how work was going. She sounded entirely comfortable. I listened to the voicemail twice and then set my phone down. What I decided in those quiet weeks was this: I was not going to explode. I was not going to call her and scream. I was not going to write a long accusatory message or forward her the photographer's post with a list of questions she could not honestly answer. I was not going to perform my hurt for an audience. I was not going to go to relatives and announce what I had found. I had watched people try those approaches with difficult family members my whole life, and I had seen how rarely they produced anything other than denial, counter-accusations, and a solidified position on all sides with no actual resolution. What I was going to do was something quieter and, I believed, more durable. I was going to stop being available. Not with announcement, not with ultimatum, not with a dramatic letter or a final phone call where I laid out my case. Just quietly, completely, and with full clarity in my own heart about why I was doing it. I was going to pull back my energy, my money, my time, and my emotional labor from a person who had spent decades using them without ever truly honoring what it cost me to give them. The first concrete step I took was financial. I canceled the 2 subscriptions I had been quietly paying on her behalf. One was a streaming service she watched constantly. One was a grocery delivery mem. Our ship she had set up using my card and never mentioned again after I noticed it on a statement. I did not call her to explain, I just canceled them. I also stopped sending the informal monthly transfer I had been making for about a year and a half. This had started as help during a period when she said she was between income sources, and it had simply never ended. It was not a large amount, but it was consistent. $300 a month. It stopped in April of 2024 without announcement or explanation. The second step was emotional. When she called, I answered less often. When I did answer, I kept the calls short. I stopped asking follow-up questions that would have extended conversations. I stopped volunteering information about my own life in ways that invited engagement. I was not rude, I was not cold. I was just becoming a smaller presence in a relationship that had always demanded I be a large one. The third step took more courage. I told 2 close friends the full story, not for drama, but because I needed people outside my own head to witness what I had experienced. My friend Dana, who has known me for 12 years and has a very clear-eyed way of speaking, listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Patricia, you have been doing all the work in this relationship for as long as I've known you. I don't think this is a betrayal that came out of nowhere. I think this is the clearest version of something that has always been true." That sentence landed somewhere important inside me and stayed. My friend Calvin, who is a therapist himself, said something different but equally useful. He said, "The interesting thing about families like yours is that the person who gives the most consistently becomes invisible. Not because they're unimportant, but because they've made it so easy not to think about them. You've never cost your mother anything, so she's never had to consider what you're worth." He said it kindly, but it stayed with me. I started seeing a therapist of my own in April of 2024. I want to include that here because it matters. I am a healthcare professional and I know the value of support, but I had spent a long time telling myself I was fine, that I had things handled, that I was the kind of person who processed things well. I was wrong. I was processing things alone, which is different. My therapist, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Ibarra, helped me understand that what I had been living inside was not just a painful event. It was a pattern, and patterns have roots. We spent a lot of time in those early sessions not on the wedding, but on what had come before it. On the childhood where I learned that love was conditional and that my job was to earn it. On the years of giving that had always found a way to feel insufficient. On the deep, quiet exhaustion of being needed without being cherished. The wedding was not the wound. The wedding was just the first time the wound had a photograph. In May of 2024, my mother called me on a Sunday afternoon. She wanted to talk about Douglas's birthday. They were thinking of having a small celebration at the house, just family and close friends, and she wanted to know if I could come down and help with some of the cooking and setup. She said it would be great to see me. She said it had been too long. She said it in the warm, confident way of someone who has no idea that the ground beneath them has shifted. I said I was not going to be able to make it. I said work was busy. I was polite. I did not give her a long explanation or an apology. She pushed a little, the way she always did when my answer was not what she expected. She said it would mean a lot to Douglas and to her. She said it was only a weekend. She said she was hoping I could finally meet some of Douglas's family in person. I almost said I would think about it. That is the old response, the automatic accommodation. The thing I had learned to say when I needed to soften a no without actually saying no, but I heard it forming in my throat and I stopped. I said clearly and calmly that I had made plans I could not change and that I hoped they had a wonderful celebration. Then I changed the subject briefly, asked how she was feeling, and ended the call after about 5 minutes. She called back an hour later. I let it go to voicemail. Her message said she hoped everything was okay and that it seemed like I had been distant lately and she just wanted to check in. There was something in her voice that was not quite worry but was close to curiosity, the sound of someone noticing that a resource they rely on might be becoming less reliable. I did not call back that evening. What happened over the next 3 months was a slow escalation of her contact. She called more often than she had in years. She texted more. She sent a card to my apartment for no apparent reason, just a thinking of you card with a brief note about how she low. Ved me and hoped I was well. She mentioned in one call that Douglas had been asking about me and wanted to meet properly. She mentioned in another call that Aunt Marguerite had asked how I was doing. She started sharing small personal things, health updates, worries about a neighbor, little stories about her daily life, as if feeding me pieces of intimacy would reopen a channel she had not realized was narrowing. I noticed all of it. I was not cold in response. I was consistent. I was the same quiet, polite, slightly harder to reach version of myself, not angry, not explained, just present in a smaller way than I had ever been. In August of 2024, she asked me for money directly. She said that she and Douglas had an unexpected expense, something related to a plumbing issue in the house, and that they were a little short before Douglas's pension check came in. She said it was only a temporary shortfall, 2 weeks at most, and that she would pay me back. I said I was not in a position to help right then and that I hoped the situation resolved quickly. She was surprised. I could hear it in the pause before she responded. She said, "Oh, okay, I just thought since you usually help." I said I understood and that things were a bit tight on my end at the moment. That was not entirely false. I had redirected money I used to send her into a dedicated savings goal I had set for myself, a solo trip to Portugal I had been putting off for years and had decided I was finally going to take. It was not a lie, it was just a different priority. My own. The conversation after that was short. She was less warm, she said she would figure it out. I said I hoped she would. We said goodbye and that was that. She did not ask for money again after that, but the calls kept coming. In September, she called to tell me she had something she wanted to discuss. I answered because I was curious enough to hear what she would say. She started with small talk, which she always did when she was building toward something. Then, after about 15 minutes, she said she had been thinking about our relationship and that she felt like something had changed between us and she wanted to talk about it. I said I had not gone anywhere. I said I was right here. She said I seemed different. She said I seemed closed off. She asked if she had done something to upset me. And here is the moment I had thought about many times in the preceding months. The moment when the question I had been waiting for finally arrived. I had practiced different versions of what I might say. I had considered saying nothing and letting the vagueness continue. I had considered sending her the photographer's link without any words and just waiting. I had considered the long, detailed conversation where I laid out every piece of evidence. What I actually said was different from any of those versions. I said, "Mom, I came across some photos from your wedding." I told her I had found Kezia Torres' work online and recognized her. I told her I had seen all the guests. And then I told her that I remembered the message she had sent me about COVID restrictions and the small ceremony with 5 people. I kept my voice calm. I said it all in a level tone. I did not yell. I did not cry. I just said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and that you are finally done pretending not to know. The silence on her end lasted so long that I thought the call had dropped. Then she spoke, and the first thing she said was not an apology. The first thing she said was, "It wasn't how it looks." I waited. She said that Douglas had a lot of family and old friends who expected to be there, and she had not wanted to cause conflict with his side of the family by having a large guest list on her side while keeping his small. She said it had been a delicate situation. She said she had not wanted to make me feel like I was competing with his family for significance. She said she had thought the COVID explanation would be easier than explaining the complicated social dynamics involved. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "So you decided that it was easier for me to believe I had been left out because of a pandemic than to have an honest conversation with me." She said, "I knew you would understand if I just explained." I said, "You are explaining it now, after I found the photos, not before." She got quiet again. I said something else then. I said, "I have added up everything I have sent you over the past 5 years. It comes to just under $11,000, not counting visits, groceries, and the subscriptions I paid without you asking." I said I did not do any of that expecting a return, but I did do it expecting to be treated like I mattered. I said the wedding was not just a missed event. It was proof of something I had been trying not to see for a long time. I did not want to go on. The point was not the list. The point was the pattern it represented, which I said clear. I told her that I had spent my entire adult life being her most reliable resource and that I had believed for a very long time that this meant I was also her most important person. But the photos told a different story. The photos showed me that when my mother curated the people she wanted in the most meaningful moment of her recent life, I was not among them. And the lie she had told me was not designed to protect me. It was designed to keep me comfortable enough to keep giving. That last sentence surprised her. I could tell by the sound she made, something between a breath and a word. She said, "Patricia, that is not fair." I said, "I know you believe that." She cried, she said she loved me and she had never meant to hurt me. She said the decision had been made quickly and she had panicked and the COVID story had felt like the kindest way to handle it at the time. She said she would do it differently if she could. I told her I believed she was saying all of that sincerely in the moment. I told her that was not the same thing as it being enough. She asked what she could do, what she could say. She asked if I needed her to apologize. She asked if I wanted to come and visit and talk through everything in person. I said I needed time, and I meant it, not as a power play, not as a withdrawal of warmth designed to punish her. I genuinely needed time because I had spent months processing something complicated and the conversation we had just had added a new layer to process. I needed to sit with what I had heard, with her explanation and her tears, and decide honestly what I wanted the future of this relationship to look like. She asked if I was going to stop talking to her entirely. I said I did not know yet. We ended the call. I sat on my couch in the silence of my apartment and felt something I had not expected. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel relieved in the way I had imagined. I felt tired. Tired in the deepest possible sense of that word, the kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with how long you have been carrying something that was never really yours to carry. I told my therapist about the call at our next session. Dr. Ibarra asked me how I had felt during the conversation. I said I had felt clear. She asked if I had felt safe. I said yes. She said that was significant because clarity and safety together were things I had not always associated with conversations with my mother. She said it sounded like something real had shifted, not just in the situation, but in me. Over the following weeks, I thought a great deal about what I wanted. The easy answer would have been to say I never wanted to speak to my mother again, but that was not actually true. The harder and more honest answer was that I wanted a different relationship than the one we had always had. A relationship where I was a person to her, not a resource, where honesty was expected of her, not optional. Where my presence in her life was something she had to earn through genuine regard, not something she could assume based on my historical habit of showing up regardless of how I was treated. I wrote her a letter, not an email. An actual letter that I wrote by hand and then typed and mailed because I wanted it to have weight. The letter was 2 pages. It was not a list of complaints. It was not a sentence-by-sentence audit of every hurt. It was a clear, simple description of what I needed from a relationship with her in order to remain in it. I said I needed honesty. I said I needed to feel like my presence in her life was something she valued rather than assumed. I said I was not interested in continuing the pattern where she brought needs, and I brought supply without either of us examining what we actually meant to each other. I said I would remain open to rebuilding something real, but that I was no longer willing to maintain the version of things we had been living inside. I also said in the letter that the financial support was over, not because I could not afford to continue it, but because I could see clearly now that it had functioned more as a reason to keep me nearby than as an expression of actual need, and that I needed to stop participating in arrangements that felt like relationships but were not. The letter took me 3 drafts to get right. My therapist read the second draft and suggested one change, which was to remove a sentence that sounded more like an accusation than a boundary. I made the change. I mailed the letter on a Thursday morning in late October. My mother called me 4 days later. She had clearly read the letter more than once because she referenced specific sections. She did not argue with the contents. She sounded different than she usually did, quieter, more careful. She said she had a lot to think about. She said she was sorry, not just sorry for the wedding, but sorry for the way things had been for a long time. She said she had not been aware or she had chosen not to be aware of what she had been asking of me. She said Douglas had read the letter too because she had wanted his perspective and that he had told her she needed to hear what I had written. That surprised me. I had no strong feelings about Douglas either way, but the fact that he had read the letter and encouraged her to hear it rather than dismiss it was not what I had expected. He called me himself 2 days after that. He said he had only known my mother for a couple of years, and so he was not in a position to speak to the long history. But he said that when he read what I had written, he recognized that I was someone who had loved her mother faithfully for a very long time and that my letter was not written in anger. He said it was written in truth. He said he was going to encourage Renata to take it seriously, and that if I was ever open to spending time with them, he genuinely wanted to know me. I thanked him, I meant it. I did not rush back into anything. I want to be clear about that. The acknowledgement felt real and the shift in my mother felt real, but I had been in this situation before, or versions of it, where a moment of accountability produced a short period of warmth that gradually faded back into the old patterns. I had learned, finally, not to respond to moments of acknowledgement with a full reopening of the door. I responded by leaving the door slightly more open than it had been, and watching carefully what came through. In November, my mother sent me a package in the mail. It was not accompanied by a request or an explanation. Inside was a photo I had not seen before. It was from when I was about 7 years old and she and I were on a beach somewhere. I think it was the Oregon coast, and I was laughing at something and she had her arm around me and she was laughing too. We looked entirely happy. On the back she had written, "This is us when it was simple. I want us to find that again." I know it will have to be different, but I want to try. I put the photo on my shelf, not because everything was resolved, not because the pattern was guaranteed to change, but because it was honest, and honesty was the thing I had asked for, and I was going to honor that ask when it came. That fall, I also went to Portugal. I want to include that because it matters. It was 12 days alone in a country I had never been to, and I walked through Lisbon and Porto and ate things I had never tasted and sat in cafes by rivers and wrote in a notebook and talked to strangers and slept in a comfortable bed in a small hotel I had saved and planned and chosen entirely for myself. I cried once on the third day, sitting at a table outside with a coffee in front of me and the sun on my face, not from sadness but from the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being completely, solely responsible for my own happiness in a moment that was asking nothing of me. I came home with a different relationship to my own life. I cannot explain it more specifically than that, but I came home knowing, in a way that felt finally settled, that the version of me who had spent years waiting to be chosen by someone who always found a reason to choose others was not a version I needed to be anymore. I had made a different choice. I had chosen myself, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the specific and practical and durable way of someone who had finally decided she was worth choosing. The situation with my mother is ongoing in the way that family always is. We speak carefully with a new kind of intentionality that was not present before. She has been more honest with me in the months since the letter than she was in the years before it. Whether that holds is something I cannot predict. I am not in the business of predicting what other people will do anymore. I am in the business of deciding what I will accept and what I will not, and responding consistently to what actually happens rather than to what I hope will happen. I still carry some grief about all of it. The wedding photos still sting when I let myself think about them. The image of all those guests celebrating while I sat alone with a cup of coffee, having believed a lie constructed to keep me comfortable, is not something I expect to fully stop feeling. But grief and clarity can live in the same body. I have learned that you do not have to be over something to be free of it. There is one more thing I want to say about Douglas, because it surprised me and I think it is worth including. In January of 2025, he called me again. He said he was not reaching out on behalf of my mother, just as himself. He said he wanted me to know that he had been learning things about my family's history that helped him understand why my mother behaved the way she did, and that he had also been learning things about me that gave him a lot of respect. He said that the woman who had written that letter, and who had the integrity to keep her word when she said things were going to be different, was someone he would be proud to have as a stepdaughter if I ever became comfortable with that. He said there was no pressure. He said he just wanted me to know. I did not know what to say, so I said thank you genuinely and asked him how he was doing. We talked for about 20 minutes about nothing in particular. It was easy in the way that conversations with honest people are easy. When we hung up, I sat for a moment and realized that the most unexpectedly decent person in the whole complicated story of my mother's wedding had been the man she married. Life does surprising things when you stop trying to control every outcome and start simply responding to what is actually in front of you. I am 34 years old. I work hard. I have a life I have built mostly by myself, with my own hands and my own choices and my own money and my own sense of what I deserve. The version of me that used to send $300 a month to someone who left me off the wedding guest list and then constructed a lie to keep me from asking questions is still a part of me, but she is not in charge anymore. The woman who wrote the letter, who mailed it on a Thursday, who flew to Portugal alone, who answered the hard phone call with a clear voice and a clear heart, she is the one running things now. And she is doing fine. More than fine, she is learning day by day what it feels like to be the most important person in her own life, not the most important person in a family system designed to extract her best self and offer very little in return. Her own life, the one she is making, the one no one can take a seat away from because she is done saving seats for people who were never really planning to show up for her. If you have ever spent years being the most reliable person in a family that somehow never made room for you in their most important moments, I want you to know that what Patricia did is not something only certain people are allowed to do. Writing the letter, stopping the automatic giving, choosing Portugal, answering the hard question with a calm voice, those are choices available to anyone who finally decides that their own comfort, dignity, and self-respect are worth the same kind of careful protection they have always given everyone else. If something in Patricia's story landed for you today, I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done? What has it cost you to be the dependable one? And have you ever found a way to come back to yourself?